Across the pond with Barry and Chad.
Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas to everyone around the world. We bid you a huge across the pond festive cheer to wherever you're watching or listening right now. Chad, Merry Christmas to you, buddy. 2020 has been one hell of a year, but we are towards the end now, aren't we?
Yeah, it's really true. I couldn't believe that it was Christmas already. This year has literally just flashed right by our very faces. Everything just seems like a blur. It still feels like a blur. I know for a while we were saying that, but it still is so true, Barry. And you're right. It is a good time to, I suppose, just celebrate the things we know and love about this period of the year, Xmas, the kind of festive season. No matter what sort of religion you are, this new beginnings, this kind of looking back onto a fresh new slate, essentially, for the new year. And in that vein, Barry, we have some new viewers and listeners too, which we would like to welcome with open arms to our podcast.
Yeah, definitely. On YouTube, we've seen lots and lots of big increases over the last couple of episodes. And so everyone who's joined us, welcome. We really do appreciate you here on Across the Pond. If you're liking what you're seeing, if you're liking what you're listening to, please subscribe. It would be the best Christmas present in the world to us. It really makes a big difference to the show, and we're hoping to grow it as much as possible. So hit that subscribe button and tell all your friends, because 2021, we've got a lot coming, Chad.
Absolutely. Well, Barry, we've got so much coming, so much to talk about today. Shall we head straight into it?
Let's do it, Chad.
The week that was.
Barry, after that wonderful upbeat introduction to this show, we got to talk about the week that was. And the week that was makes it tricky for me to be upbeat. It makes it tricky for me to have this smile on my face, Barry. Because as much as it is Christmas and as much as there's so much to be happy and excited about, I almost feel like Christmas has been cancelled. And in that way, I'm going to be removing my headgear. Just because
I think so.
Because we've got some trickier stuff
some tough topics
to talk about today.
Yeah.
And so the first one is that, Barry, me feeling like Christmas has been cancelled. Over the weekend, we had an announcement, some tough news, and in really quick succession, the actual sort of enforcement of that news. And that is that London and some parts of the southeast of England are going into effectively another lockdown, but they've branded it something different, Barry. They've branded it as, well, you're still in the tiers, but this is tier 4. We had the joke about all the different tiers and what they mean, before. But yeah, essentially, we're in another lockdown. Shops are closed. All sort of personal care places, hairdressers, all that stuff, all closed again. Gyms closed, everything closed. And the sort of previous concession that we had for Christmas, which was 5 days where you can interact within this bubble of 3 households, sleep over, do whatever you want in this bubble, that's been taken away from us, Barry. And so for me, it feels like Christmas has been cancelled.
I'm so sorry, Chad. It really is a brutal state of affairs. And unfortunately, like most of 2020, COVID, the monster, rears its ugly head once again. And even with all the talk of vaccines and all the positive sentiment coming out of a lot of these trials, unfortunately, we've seen cases skyrocket in the UK and elsewhere around the world, and on this side of the pond as well, Chad. And unfortunately, we're not there yet. We're not out of the woods yet. And so drastic action had to be taken. And the fact that it happens over Christmas makes it just 1,000 times worse. Yeah. And so I think for morale's sake, I'm wondering what it feels like on that side. I'm sure it must be very somber, very sad, very frustrating. But unfortunately, this is what maybe needs to be done in order to try and keep this under control and buy you guys enough time to kind of wait for those vaccines to be ready. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that it's the right thing to do. We've seen the case numbers rising. There's no doubt. But you're right. On the ground, I'm feeling devastated in a way, Barry. I mean, I've felt this myriad of emotions this past week that, I thought I was over for this year. I thought that we had, gone through all of the bad stuff that we were going to feel this year. But I think it's that excitement that we had just a few days ago, as we were recording this on Monday night. Just a few days ago, Boris was going to say, have a merry little Christmas. Have a Christmas, but with as little people as possible. And that's now been taken away from us. It's kind of like when we're headed into the second lockdown, Barry, we had this wonderful carrot. You guys have 5 days of grace. And so I think with that carrot, they were able to get a lot of compliance because people said, okay, sure, we'll do short-term, pain, long-term gain kind of thing. We'll have our Christmas at least. And now we don't even have that. And I guess part of the reason why this is all happening is because there's this new strain of COVID. Now, we knew that it was always going to be a virus that was able to mutate and change, and just like all other viruses, like flus and like other ones in the past. But this new strain, weirdly enough, has this kind of change in the spike protein that makes it kind of up to 70% more transferable than the previous one, which is why we're seeing this crazy spike in cases. And I believe you guys in SA as well have this other mutation as well that shares something in common, but very interestingly, and something I find very interesting, Barry, is that they're not related. It's not the same mutation that we're seeing in the UK. So independently, the virus has changed on two opposite parts of the globe.
Yeah, I think that's how evolution works, right? This virus, if you think about it from the virus's perspective, they're trying to live and trying to survive as best they can. And the humanity is kind of on an onslaught to try and destroy this virus at every point it can. And so the virus is going to mutate, it's going to evolve. And like you said, we expected this. We expected a bunch of new strains in the same way that the flu virus changes every single year. So your flu vaccine from last year doesn't work on this year's flu, for example. That's what viruses do. That's what organisms do. And the fact that it is like diverting into new strains is not that noteworthy.
Yep.
What is noteworthy, like you say, is that increase in transferability and how contagious it's becoming. And also the fact that I find it interesting that South Africa and the UK are the two countries where these new strains have developed first, right? Yeah. And so it's very, very strange that we are the chosen ones in that sense. Maybe it talks to our lack of adherence to some of the policies. Maybe it talks to some of the naughtiness within the two countries. But yeah, it's really not good news at all. And for Christmas, with this which is coming down the pipe, it's devastating, absolutely devastating. But at the end of the day, we have to look after life. We have to look after health as best we can. And if this was what it takes, then unfortunately that's what it's going to be. And 2020 has been a year like none other. It kind of feels appropriate that Christmas in 2020 is also going to be a year like no other, as sad as that is.
You're right. You're completely right. How could we be surprised that this was going to be taken away from us, this one little win that we were going to have? But it is what it is. Yeah. I am very downbeat currently, but I will see things in better light at some point in time. I've got to grieve for this loss, Barry, because it is that. The one other thing I wanted to chat about on this kind of topic is the swift response we've seen from countries around the world to the UK after announcing these measures on Saturday night. There are currently, as we speak, Barry, this is again on Monday night, 40 countries that have imposed within literally the last 2 days measures to ban people from the UK entering into those countries. We're talking about Canada, we're talking about Germany, France, Italy, etc., a long list of countries. And that is really quite interesting.
Yeah, definitely. I think everyone has learned from the first kind of wave and the first 1.5 wave of this virus to know that the earlier you do things, the better. Yeah. Especially if there's a new strain around, like you need to close those borders as soon as possible. And that's why we've seen like a domino effect as to one country, the next country, the next country. And all of a sudden, like you say, 40 countries, and I'm sure it'll keep growing over the next couple of days in an attempt to keep that second strain out, or an attempt to keep those case numbers out. At the end of the day, it's not possible to keep it out completely. There are definitely people in the UK who's taken that strain across already, but you can minimize that damage. And that's kind of the idea, is to try and mitigate that damage as much as possible so you can maintain this. I think everyone has kind of realized that we're not out of the woods yet. And hopefully this is kind of a wake-up call for everyone around the world that even with all the talk of the vaccines, we're still far away from a solution for this problem. And those travel bans are going to mess with a lot of people's travel plans. They're going to mess with a lot of holidays that were planned. It can mess with a lot of seeing families and whatnot. But it's something these countries have to do to try and mitigate that damage right at their border, to kind of make sure that all the hard work they've done to bring the cases down in the individual countries isn't then undone by people traveling in and bringing it with them.
Absolutely. And it's understandable that those bans are there, Barry. But I guess one of the kind of unintended consequences is that there are now food shortage concerns and slight shortage concerns. I'm not going to kind of dramatize this, but essentially we're talking about channels between the UK and France, which have now been temporarily closed. We've heard from Boris Johnson that within the next few hours it might be resolved, and by the time we release this episode, that may have been the case. But there certainly were, last night, 500 lorries piled up back to back trying to get across the channel, essentially. And that may not have been intended. They may not have even seen that coming. But essentially, because of the Brexit preparations, which are, also around the corner, they've been able to deal with that. So I guess good to have those plans having gone on in the background in any case.
You just can't script this stuff, right? You could never write a story like this that actually works out. The background of Brexit and all the drama and all the chaos about the UK's independence and the UK's ability to be self-sustaining and not rely on the trade deals within the EU and within the rest of the world. All these discussions have been happening for the last, 2 or 3 years, however long Brexit's been taking. And to see now it kind of being forced upon them with a non-Brexit related reason is so interesting. Yeah. And in this globalized world we've been chatting about for the past years, how these supply chains are so interconnected and countries are specializing in goods and then they're supplying huge proportions of the world. And all of a sudden, if you can't get those goods over the border, like you say, things can get quite dire quite quickly. And so I think what will happen post-pandemic is we'll have to re-look at this whole globalization and look at how do we think about supply chains. And individual countries have to figure out, listen, what happens if we can't get access to these trade deals for months at a time, right? What if we are relying on other countries to produce key basics or food or electricity or any of these sorts of things? And that's going to put a real span in the works when you think about your strategy as a nation going forward. And maybe you have to bring some of that stuff in-house, even at a higher cost, but to manage some of that risk that all of a sudden if a pandemic happens or something like that, you can't get access to those resources.
Yeah, definitely. And it's been one of the key topics throughout this pandemic, I suppose, from the start, is that role of globalization and I guess decentralizing, which is essentially a complete reversal of everything that we've been doing for the last couple of decades. So Barry, that's my week. That's why I was downbeat, and I guess I just needed a little bit of sympathy from that side of the pond. Tell me about your past week. You were in Kruger National Park. I'm very jealous, sitting around a campfire, looking up at the stars, looking at some, big four. I'm really, really upset.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Chad. I can't deny that I've had a great couple of days. The Kruger was amazing to get away from Joburg and get away into the bush. There's nothing like sitting around a fire and just staring into those flames and kind of forgetting about the rest of the world. And so that was a really wonderful experience. I desperately needed it after a really stressful couple of weeks. And so it really was fuel for the soul, Chad. But unfortunately, that doesn't last forever, and you have to come back to reality eventually. Yep. And coming back to reality on this side is South Africa's worries with this coronavirus. And don't worry, we are right there with you, Chad. We are on the same path as the UK, unfortunately. And our good old friend Uncle Cyril had called a family meeting the other day and basically announced a whole range of new measures to deal with the rising cases we're seeing here in South Africa. As we mentioned earlier, there's a new strain here, so people are very worried about that, but also the cases are just rising and rising and rising and rising. I was chatting to a friend of mine who works in a hospital in Morningside, and she was saying that in the last week, the number of COVID patients has tripled out of nowhere. Wow. And so we are already in the midst of a second wave, and it's a weird situation here in South Africa because I think Cyril would want to do the kind of lockdown that the UK has done. I think that would have been his first priority and first choice, but we just cannot afford it. The economy cannot afford another lockdown, and so South Africa is going to have to find a very creative way. We're going to have to pull from some sort of reach of discipline and kind of pride for the country to try and fix this problem and try and get through the second wave, because we simply cannot afford to shut everything down again, because unemployment is in high 40s, almost 50%. You cannot let that get any higher. Wow. It's absolutely insane. And so South Africa is in a very, very tough position. And the family meeting was to introduce a whole range of new regulations, closing beaches over the festive season, putting a curfew in place, trying to limit the amount of people traveling across borders, etc., etc., etc. But it kind of feels like Band-Aids on a much bigger problem, Chad. Yeah,
definitely. I mean, I did tune into the most part of that announcement and took from it a lot of those things that you just mentioned, Barry, which is really, really tricky, because you do have a government that wants to take action, but simply just can't. I guess the question is how far you can push that, really, Barry, before it becomes a big problem for everyone involved. I guess that leads me on very nicely to my next point, which was basically talking about the vaccine and talking about how we're going to essentially escape this pandemic. Talking about SA's financial position, all of that kind of stuff, I came across a story that essentially they had placed an order which required a deposit to be paid at a certain date. The Solidarity Fund, I believe, were there and ready to make the payment, but they were struggling to get a guarantee for the rest of this order from National Treasury.
It's such a difficult story, this, Chad, because obviously it's been going like wildfire here in the country. And kind of the headline and the narrative that these news sources are writing about is this idea that South Africa's missed this deadline and therefore is not going to get the vaccine. Yeah. And that's it's simply not true, yeah. And it's very misleading because people read headlines and they don't read the rest of the article. They don't actually look into it. So it's very complicated, and the Department of Health has kept their cards very close to their chest. So it's hard to know what to say on this point. But I want to bring that up right at the beginning to say that it's way more nuanced than the media is making it out to be, of course, right? As far as I understand, like you say, there was a deposit of 15% required to pay this organization called COVAX. And COVAX has got agreements with, I think, 9 different vaccines around the world with the idea they're going to help distribute, right? Cool. And so we were paying a deposit to try and get access to a certain number of vaccines from COVAX itself. COVAX includes the Oxford University AstraZeneca study, that's one of the 9, and then 8 other ones. But they do not have the rights or the agreements for the 2 that have been regulatory approved in the US and the UK, which is the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, right? So that's a different thing completely. Nonetheless, it's still very important we get our hands on a portion of the COVAX vaccine. And we've seen a lot of the rich countries around the world spending a lot of money to get huge orders from COVAX. And unfortunately, in countries like South Africa, where we have to come up with hundreds of millions of rands overnight, it is a very, very challenging thing to do. So as far as I understand, from reading a couple sources, I think what happened is that they had some sort of administrative error. Right. I think the right documents were signed, but something got lost along the way, or some person didn't follow through, or whatever it was, and they'd missed that date to kind of put that order in. So I don't know what's going to happen going forward. I don't think it means we're never going to get those vaccines, but it is worrying to see those sort of errors made on such an important piece of information. According to the order, I think it's going to cover about 1.7 million people, which is a tiny amount of the population, about 3% of the population, and it's due for about the second quarter of 2021. So those are all the facts, I think, Chad. But again, it's important to know that these stories are very, very manipulative, and a lot of the times you can't just read the headlines. Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, even interesting that we both read a whole bunch of articles and we have kind of different understandings of what the problem was. Because I understood that it was essentially a guarantee that the funds were there ready to be made. Like you said, on the Solidarity Fund's part, they were all ready to make this payment. But there was a guarantee for the remaining order, I believe, that they just struggled to get. I don't know if that was maybe that administrative part, Barry. But again, I mean, like you said, it is just a small portion of the population. But I guess pretty key that, you know, in terms of this thing that is apparently going to rescue us from this pandemic, important things to not have silly administrative errors on, I would think.
Absolutely imperative. And I don't want to downplay it. I think it's a terrible mistake if that's the case. And I think that the difference in our understanding, Chad, is because the administrative error is the Department of Health's official statement. Right. Who knows if that's true or not, right? So a lot of the reporting is claiming background sources and claiming all sorts of other stuff. So no one actually knows what the truth is. But like you say, it's a big problem if that's the case, because even though it's a small amount of people, those vaccines need to get to our health workers immediately, right? If we're going to handle a second wave, we need to have all of our health workers vaccinated so that they are able to work and work and work and work. Because unfortunately, at the moment, we're seeing health workers get COVID all the time, and then they have to spend 2 weeks away from their job, and we need those people in those hospitals in order to care for the second wave that is coming. Yeah. And so, I think it's very important we get this right. I'm hoping that they fix whatever needs to be fixed. And who knows what the truth is, Chad, but it certainly doesn't look good from a South African perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Hopefully you guys have too many vaccines to even handle, more than the population needs at some point in time. That's all we could ever hope for. Let's see what happens.
All right, Chad, moving on to something a little bit more exciting. I've been very excited to wear these hats that we brought. And the first 2 stories are a bit somber, but this one is a bit happier. So I'm gonna put my reindeer hats on, Chad.
Okay, I'll join you.
Because it is Christmas after all.
Let me join you.
There we go. Listen to those bells ring. We have to celebrate a little bit of Christmas here, Chad. And we're going to chat about Harry and Meghan, the royals, the infamous royals, who apparently have turned to podcasting, I believe.
They have, and I wonder, seeing as we are podcasting right now, what those rings are going to sound like for all of our listeners who have no context. I'd imagine it'll be a slightly annoying few minutes, but no worries, we will remove the headgear at another point in time.
Indeed, Chad. I'll try and keep my head as still as I can, but if you do have to deal with a couple bells, I do apologize.
But yeah, I mean, the story that we're going to be talking about now is pretty key, pretty imperative. This thing that is podcasting that didn't exist a decade or so ago. I mean, it's been around for a while. I think we understate how long podcasting has been a thing. I mean, I used to do little podcasts with my dad when I was a little kid, little podcast pretending we had our little radio show going. I certainly at some point in time want to talk about that, and we will bring some clips and stuff and just talk about that, Barry. But nevertheless, this is talking about Meghan and Harry. Of course, we're talking about the royal family, the British royal family, and they've essentially signed a deal with Spotify, reportedly worth £30 million, going into podcasting, essentially. And some commentators say, Barry, that for that kind of amount of money, they're going to have to, at some stage, spill a few royal-specific pieces of content.
Do Spotify have a money tree? How are they paying for all of these podcasts? They bought the Joe Rogan podcast for reportedly $100 million. They've got Michelle Obama and 1,000 other really high-profile people to try and push this podcasting game. They really have decided to take Apple on and kind of try and make themselves the podcasting platform of choice. And so, yes, I'm sure that the money here is absolutely insane as well. And I wonder what kind of royal secrets, Jay. We chatted about the crown last week and about how the insider view of the royal family is very interesting for so many people. If they were able to spill a couple of those, they would have millions and millions of people watching their stuff and listening to their stuff.
Absolutely. And I guess that you've got to ask the reason why all of these companies are willing to pay them so much money. Yes, they're famous. Yes, they're going to attract an audience. But ultimately, they're going to have some good content there to keep people and to make, I suppose, their investment worthwhile. And this is coming off the back of Netflix having very recently, also signed a deal with them. We're not quite sure yet what it all entails, but that's reportedly worth £100 million. Now, we know that Harry and Meghan have left the royal family to try and become financially independent. They wanted to make money. They wanted to, be commercial, and ultimately the breakaway from that family is key for that. We still don't know quite what the terms are going to be when the Queen actually does lay out that sort of exit, what people are now calling Megxit, Barry. Harry and Meghan leaving the British family. But yes, you do certainly have to wonder what kind of content they're going to be contributing for those kind of amounts of money.
Yeah, I'm very curious. I'm very curious to see what they come up with. I'm sure they're going to be very thoughtful about it, and I think they're two very thoughtful people. And so I'm curious to see what they're going to do. But for us, Chad, it's really exciting for the world of podcasting. The more of these big names that come into this format and kind of validate it, give it status, give it credibility, is really, really good for the field of audio. And I think it's awesome to see. It's a very competitive space, of course. Like you say, they're going to have to fight against the juggernauts of this podcasting world. But the fame that they have, the reach that they have, the loyal fans that they have, I'm sure they're going to make a success of it. And we'll just have to see what they do with it, whether it's kind of a charitable type thing, whether it's more of an insider kind of giving a look at the life of royals. I don't know. We have to wait and see.
Yeah, you're completely right, Barry. The more people that come onto this platform, the better, because it is a platform that I think can touch people's lives in a way no other platform can. I think about all of my long walks and strolls with all of these really meaningful, thought-provoking conversations that I hear people having. And it really has affected me in a pretty profound way. So very happy that casting is a thing. And I must be honest, on a kind of side note, Barry, I'm really impressed at how still you're keeping your head. It's the kind of most still I've ever seen Barry be when talking, because if you haven't watched us on video before, he is quite an enthusiastic speaker.
Chad, it's so difficult. I'm trying to keep myself composed, and still, I usually nod like a crazy person. I had a friend who was saying that when I'm on the podcast, apparently I nod like 3 times a second, which is a bit crazy, and I use my hands a lot, and I've been trying to keep very composed, so I hope I'm doing a decent
Doing
job.
very well. Hats off to you, Barry. Next thing and the last thing, I know it feels like we're just jumping from thing to thing, and that's not what we want to do, but there's just lots to talk about this week, guys, so sorry about that. And that is in the field of gaming. We've spoken about gaming a few times, and I think it's an important conversation to have because it really is taking the world by storm now that we are in the situation that we're in and people have a lot more time on their hands. We're talking about Sony, and they very recently released the PS5. We spoke about that before, Barry. And one of the sort of flagship titles that they were going to release, following that console, is a game called Cyberpunk 2077. And I don't know too much about this game, Barry, but I believe that this was one of the most hyped up games this year, for release this year. And it's now been pulled from the PlayStation Store over sort of glitches, over health concerns, and yeah, it really has been something like nothing else. A lot of people were very, very excited to get their hands onto this game and to start playing it, and it caused seizures. Like I said, it caused all these bugs and glitches. And I must just mention, Barry, that it is extremely rare for PlayStation to pull a game after its initial release. So to see this happening this past week was really, really quite interesting to see.
Yeah, it really is a big misstep from Sony. Like, this was the game of the season. This was like the Christmas stocking stuffer. This was one of the key games on the PS5 that was kind of going to showcase the PS5 and all its like wonder. And I think, as far as I understand, they were trying to push the boundaries with graphics, right? So Cyberpunk 2077 is very, very visual. It's kind of set in the future, obviously. It's very, very cyber. It's very VR related. The graphics are insane. And some of the playthroughs and some of the videos I've seen were absolutely amazing. But again, if you're trying to push these boundaries and you're trying to like do things that never been done before, if you don't make sure you cover all your bases and make sure there's no problems and make sure the glitches are fixed and whatnot, you can be in real trouble. And so I don't know about the medical stuff. I have read about some of those seizures. And I think it's because of all the flashing lights and the very, very intense graphics that comes with this game. But for something as big as this game to have those sort of problems is a real worry for the company. It causes huge reputational damage. I mean, like you say, the hype was incredible. They paid so many influencers to play it and talk about it. It was absolutely insane. Huge budget spent on this. And you pull the game a couple weeks or a couple days into its release, it really doesn't look good for Sony.
Definitely. And for all of those gamers, Barry, who were so excited and eager for this release, I know people were queuing up to get this game, and to now be queuing up again to get that refund really must make a lot of people feel quite silly. I do believe that the PC version is a lot more stable than the console, so it really does make you question, I guess, the ability of this new console. Is it really that much further along in terms of graphics and just performance capability? Because, how could this have happened where you have a game that a developer put together, obviously on 2 different platforms? The one platform seems to be alright, and the other platform is causing quite a lot of problems. Like you say, $330 million spent on this game, making it one of the most expensive games ever made in history. And yeah, I mean, now they're back to the drawing board, really.
Yeah, definitely. And after all the hype of the PS5 and all the lines and the queues and people desperately trying to get their hands on them, to have a flagship game like this, an ambassador game that really tries to showcase the best of the best, it's not a good look. And so I'm sure the investigation will continue, and they'll try and figure out what exactly happened and what they can do to fix things. But I think that your Xbox users are smiling, Chad, in the corners of their Xboxes. I think Microsoft are very happy about this. And the war continues between Sony and Microsoft to win the consoles.
Indeed. And just talking about people trying to get their hands on the consoles as well, I don't know if you've heard, Barry, of the insane markups that have been happening on these consoles. So people, when they were pre-released, just went out and did these bulk orders in the same way we see some really popular concerts, across the world, people bulk buying and then reselling them at like 100% markup. For context, you can buy the digital edition of the PlayStation 4, I think about £360. And over here at secondhand retail stores, you'll find them selling for £1,000, Barry.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, that is an insane amount of money. That is an insane amount of money.
Yeah, it is insane. And the fact that people are actually buying these consoles, we've seen proposed legislation coming from governments across the world trying to ban the resale of these consoles. And that, I guess, just speaks to, the environment that we're in. People are at home. They're kind of desperate to get their hands on the newest tech. And when we see these step-ups in generation on Sony platforms, I mean, let's think about when the last one was released. It's a number of years before you see these new releases. It's very different to, I guess, when we're talking about an iPhone that gets released every year. People are pretty excited to get their hands on this thing. So yeah, unfortunate that a couple of people are taking advantage of that position, but unfortunately, that is what it is.
That's how the market works, right? And we see it in sneakers, we see it in iPhones, we see it in all sorts of things. Concert tickets, like you mentioned. Yep. It's this idea of when there's a scarce resource and people are really want it, and that's how the price works, right? That's how these guys make their money. And so if you're not willing to wait for it, you're going to have to pull out a lot of cheddar from that wallet of yours, Chad, to get that PS5.
Oh no, I'm not in that line. Barry, let's move on to the next segment.
Stuff I found interesting.
So, Chad, we have to take off this headgear again, unfortunately, because we have to talk about another story that just doesn't feel right wearing some sort of Christmassy gear. And I promise you, it's just coincidence that all of these stories are happening on the Christmas episode. We do apologize for that, but this stuff is fascinating and it's important to chat about. And on this week, on Stuff I Found Interesting, I watched a documentary series over the last week or so, a 4-part series, Chad, which was very detailed and very specific about the life of Oscar Pistorius. Okay. Now, for those of you who don't know, Oscar Pistorius is a hero that turned into a villain in 2014, I think it was, or 2013, when he was accused and eventually convicted of murdering his girlfriend. Before that, he was the South African hero. He was the very first Paralympian across the world to run in the Olympics. He's known as the Blade Runner. He's got these prosthetic legs and is an absolutely amazing sprinter. Broke every Paralympic record in the books, from the 100, the 200, the 400 meters. Destroyed the field. Was like way ahead of everyone else. Fought to make his way into able-bodied competitions, and eventually got to the semi-finals of the Olympics in the year that he ran. And so, an incredible athlete that was a hero to so many. He was a Nike-sponsored athlete. He was a hero to the disabled community and people all around the world. And there was this dramatic event, like I say, in 2013, 2014, where he murdered his girlfriend. And it caused this media stir like South Africa has never, ever seen, Chad. And I watched this 4-part ESPN documentary about his life and just found it absolutely fascinating. Do you remember when this happened, Chad? Do you remember kind of the feeling?
I remember the day and I remember the moment, Barry, when I first saw the news. It was was Valentine's Day as well that this happened, which was the crazy thing too. And yeah, the absolute beautiful girlfriend that he had at the time, who really could do no wrong in anyone's eyes. Similar really to the discussion we had the other day about Diana, Barry, I feel in a lot of ways. Just this beautiful soul. And when we all heard of this news, and I guess, like you say, the media storm that followed with the open airing of the court battle, it was the first time a lot of us were able to actually watch the proceedings of a legal battle happen in real time. We all got infatuated with the idea of his attorney who was defending him, and all of the various little bits and pieces in that case. It's hard to forget.
It really is, and it's such an insane story. It had like such incredible highs and lows within the story, and even within this trial, Chad, because it wasn't like he was saying he wasn't guilty. He admitted to shooting her. It wasn't about who did it. It was about who did he think he was shooting at the time. And his story, his defense that they stuck to throughout their trial was that he thought it was an intruder that had broken into his house, and he was trying to kind of take care of the two of them, and ended up shooting this supposed intruder through the door of a bathroom, not knowing that it was actually his girlfriend who had got up from the bed and gone to the bathroom. So that was his defense, and so he kind of stuck to that and kind of was very emotional throughout, because obviously he had murdered his own girlfriend. The state obviously didn't believe this and kind of pushed for murder charges. And like you said, it was shown on live TV. And I remember the whole country basically shut down. Every time this was happening, the whole country shut down. There was a news channel on DSTV dedicated just to this trial. That's how big this was. And I think that's what the documentary kind of brings out a lot, is that this wasn't just one story. This was an indication, a kind of a a very public viewing as to into the South African justice system, looking at how do our courts run, kind of how do things happen. In South Africa, of course, we've had this brutal history of apartheid. We've seen lots of corruption post-apartheid. And for a lot of South African citizens, they haven't been able to see, is our justice system actually working? And so to be able to watch into this trial and see it happen day by day, it was a real transparent kind of view into what South Africa looks like in the courts. The second piece of this was that South Africa did and still does deal with a huge problem with gender-based violence and lots of home and domestic abuse. And this case was kind of seen as a symbol for the larger social problem. This very, very privileged, white, rich, successful man who shot his girlfriend and kind of is the same fate that so many women have faced in South Africa in lots of different reasons. And this was because he was famous, because it was such a crazy story, it became this symbol. And so the documentary kind of talks to the fact that this wasn't just about Oscar shooting his girlfriend. It was about lots of other social conversations and lots of discussions within South Africa and within the rest of the world as to what this kind of this violence means and what it means to live in a country where you're scared about intruders coming into your house. What it means to live in a country where it's way too common for men to kill or to wound or to injure people that they're close to, especially females, especially children. And this documentary was just a really interesting kind of look back on that case, Chad, with some fresh eyes. And I realized that no one actually knows what happened on that night. Right, except for Oscar. Oscar's the only person who knows what happened. And at the time, of course, everyone was picking sides, trying to figure out who are they going to side with and what do they think happened. But when you look at the evidence kind of without emotion and objectively, it's very hard to get a sense as to what actually happened that night, Chad.
Yeah, Barry, 100% right. And just to kind of talk to that global scale of the story, when I moved over to the UK, I had kind of not forgotten about it, but obviously wasn't as top of mind as when we were living through this kind of story and the case and all of that stuff. But the amount of people this side that asked me if I knew about Oscar Pistorius was just astounding. It honestly touched every single corner of the globe in a way that I could never have ever foreseen. And you're right, it was just because of that publicity and the kind of openness of being able to go into the courts and kind of see how the process works, that everyone was able to look at each little nuance in the story and kind of decide for themselves. And Barry, correct me if I'm wrong, but if I think about it and I think about the verdict and how that all worked, there was a bit of a change, wasn't there, after the first verdict? And then obviously that followed through to the sentencing.
A huge change, Chad. So eventually, after months and months and months of this trial, Judge Masipa at the time convicted Oscar of culpable homicide, but not first-degree murder. Her verdict at the end was that he had a reasonable case to make that he didn't know who was behind that door. And so for that reason, it was kind of convicted as culpable homicide. And South Africa went into uproar because it felt like he was getting away with murder. He literally was, right? And that's where that saying comes from, I suppose. And that was a judgment at the time and caused a lot of drama. The state didn't accept that, and they appealed it to the High Court and to the Supreme Court and basically to the highest courts in the land. And eventually it was overturned and it was converted into a murder charge, but not for the reason that they thought that he had changed his idea or changed his plan, which I kind of thought. I thought that they had looked at Masipa's verdict and decided it made the wrong verdict. But what actually happened was they realized that even if it wasn't Reaver, right? Even if you take Reaver out of it and you think about it, Oscar still murdered somebody. And without being provoked, without being shot at himself, and he's still convicted murder, it actually doesn't matter who it was. Unfortunately, like that's how the law works. And so he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to prison. He still is in prison today, but not because he killed Reaver, but because he killed a human. Right. And so that was kind of the legal precedent that was set. But unfortunately, that change of judgment didn't have the same publicity that the original trial had, because people had moved on, the news cycle had moved on. And so I think a lot of South Africans felt hard done by, feeling that Oscar didn't kind of have that moment in court where he was sentenced to murder in front of the eyes of the world. And who knows what the right decision was, Chad. It's so hard to tell.
It definitely is. But it certainly seems like a very interesting documentary series to watch. I'll certainly try and get my eyes on it because, you're right, Barry. Sometimes when you live through these experiences and look back on them again, it just does remind you of what a crazy story that was. What a crazy time, I guess, to live through all of that stuff happening. Barry, shall we move on then to our next segment?
Let's look ahead, Chad.
Looking ahead.
All right, we are looking ahead, but we are kind of looking backwards a little bit, because as I talk, Barry is putting on a cloak of sorts, a cloak for his head, and I'm following suit in putting this Santa Claus cloak on my head. I wouldn't call it a cloak traditionally, but I'm calling it a cloak because we're talking about a story that ultimately makes all of the Harry Potter fans out there very, very happy. And that is that there's been some research going on, Barry, to invent a cloak that can make you invisible.
It sounds crazy, Chad. It sounds insane. And when you put the link on here, I was like, there's no way. There's no way. What are you talking about? But after looking into it and reading about it, Chad, it does seem like somewhat plausible. And these guys in South Korea think they've developed something that can make a human invisible in real life, even muggles. And that is very exciting news if that's the case, Chad.
Love it. Love the Harry Potter speak. I mean, Barry, you did tell me about how much of a story, how that story changed your life ultimately, and how much, it stuck with you as a kid.
It's the greatest story of all time, Chad, and I refuse to accept anything else. I refuse to debate that. As a child, I was enamored by that story, and I was that guy who was in the queue at exclusive books at midnight to pick up the new volume when it was coming out, and I must have read those books 20 plus times at least. And so I'm a huge, huge super fan. When I went to Harry Potter World in the US, I ran around like a little kid for hours, and so hearing about this invisibility cloak coming out of South Korea is super exciting, Chad, and I'm fascinated.
Yeah, I mean, let's just talk about why they're developing it. So it sounds like it's coming from a military sort of standpoint and angle, where they can blend in with the environment that they're in without having to wear camo and put mud on their face and do all of that kind of stuff. But there's an added advantage too, Barry, and that is that they can control the temperature as well, and potentially avoid being picked up by thermal cameras.
Yeah, it sounds like that. I think the way they're trying to do it, obviously the science is a bit beyond our comprehension, Chad, but as far as I understand, it's like a rudimentary green screen in a way. So like almost this artificial suit is filled with thousands and thousands and thousands of pixels, and the idea is that it's going to pick up, like you say, from the surroundings, like what kind of environment are you in, and try and create a pixel version of that environment so you can kind of blend into that background. And that infrared thing is also fascinating because, like if you think about it, in night warfare or in like modern warfare, there's a lot of like heat-seeking type equipment that uses that rather than relying on observation. And so they're able to kind of cool the body or heat the body to match whatever temperature there is and kind of get rid of that heat signature. That's a complete game changer when it comes to a military context.
Fascinating. Not that we like to talk about war, not that we want to kind of promote the use of this type of equipment, but it is certainly fascinating that it's under development. And yeah, like I said, for all Harry Potter fanatics out there, something really cool too. I almost wonder whether they are going to get an influx of orders from all of these people who love going to kind of cosplay events and dressing up and all of that type of stuff. Or do you think the price point here is just not going to be accessible to the average consumer?
Yeah, my gut says that the price of this is going to be astronomical. And so if you're going to be a cosplayer with this artificial suit on, you're going to be the talk of the town and you will win Comic-Con for sure. I wonder what J.K. Rowling thinks about this, and I wonder if they're going to be able to tie any Harry Potter type stuff into this, because of course Harry Potter has been such a ginormous phenomenon across the world, and it's hard to not see those parallels. It's hard not to think about Harry throwing that cloak over him and doing all the mischief in Hogwarts. And so I'm excited to watch the story play out and see if there is something to this, and if this thing actually turns into something rather special. It'll be a huge step forward for technology.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, while we're on the military kind of talking point, Barry, you came across another story this week.
Indeed, Chad. We're chatting about submarine communication. So if you imagine you've got a submarine deep in the ocean and you've got a friend submarine who is far away from you, you can't just WhatsApp the guy because unfortunately the Wi-Fi is not great underwater, and there's lots of issues about how do you communicate. And so a lot of military have been trying to figure out what is the best way to communicate. And so what these guys in China have decided, Chad, is to take some inspiration from nature and looking at these whales that communicate across vast distances with these incredible songs, right? We've heard about whales being able to make these really, really strange ethereal sounds underwater that kind of transfer across large distances and they communicate via that way. So these guys, and they must be wacky scientists of some sort, have decided, Chad, they want to try and do that. They want to try and make whale sounds that are decodable by humans. And so what they've done is they've tried to decode and try to like synthesize like artificial whale sounds and then give someone else basically the key to that code and see if they can translate secret messages from submarine to submarine. And I just thought that's a fascinating idea, absolutely bizarre and absolutely wacky. But if it works, it changes everything about submarine warfare.
Yeah, it definitely is a weird and wacky thing to hear, Barry. And if I'm honest, at first instinct, I hate everything about this. Because again, this is humans coming into the wild and now basically throwing these confusing signals at the way of whales who are going to be hearing these signals and potentially are going to be caught off guard or taken off track or, might even kind of fear some sort of existential crisis or another bigger whale that is going to come and kill them or something crazy. It's just, again, another story of humans going into a foreign environment and ultimately, because they can, claiming it as their own.
Yeah, exactly, Chad. It's another example of that. It's the hubris of humanity, this idea that we are the only species that matter and everyone else should kind of just bow to our interests, right? And so it's not great to see that. I think that there are interesting technological challenges and interesting kind of technology that could come out of this. But like you say, it's kind of in an ethical gray area and it's nothing new for China, Chad. China are willing to take these sorts of risks, unfortunately. And so who knows whether it's true or not, who knows like how effective it is or any of that sort of thing. I also wonder how many submarines are actually in action these days.
Yeah.
I know that warfare has moved very much to cyber warfare and much more tactical, diplomatic type warfare. I wonder how many submarines are actually out there. I can't think it's more than like 1,000 or so. I don't know, Chad.
Yeah, good question. I have no idea either. But you're right. It is one of those which might have some wonderful kind of technological learnings. I mean, we talk about the way that bats communicate, all of this stuff. There's undoubtedly is a lot of fascinating things to learn from nature. But whether that kind of gives us the right to go out and, confuse all of these species with our own takes on their sort of signals is, again, like you say, an interesting ethical question. But yeah, interesting to hear that story. Let's move on to the next segment.
Develop and grow.
It's at our favorite juncture of the podcast, Barry, where we cast the lens inward a little bit and start to talk about things we've realized about ourselves. And this week, not just this week, but this year, I'm going to say this year as a whole, I've been really struggling, Barry, in finding my photography style. Now, I'm not talking about my actual kind of capturing style. I'm very happy with the photos that I take in terms of composition and ultimately, making sure that the focus is in the right point, the technical aspect of creating a good image. It's when I'm in the edit room and you have millions of decisions to make. How do you want this thing to look? And ultimately, every photographer needs to have an identity. You want to be ideally at a point where someone will see one of your photos and have a reasonable expectation of what the rest of your work looks like, the quality of the rest of your work. And, ultimately you're looking for something that has a kind of consistent brand through it. And I've just been struggling to find that style. And it's something that has been kind of paralyzing me from posting photos. I'll go through and I'll post millions of photos on my story, but not commit them to actual posts because of the fact that I am unsure about my style. And it's something that's quite tricky to solve, and I don't quite have a solution at this particular point in time, Barry. But the observation that I had is that I'm getting frustrated because I'm looking at the end goal. I'm trying to be that kind of professional photographer who has his style, has it all figured out, and is able to kind of assert their identity onto the world, as an example. Where I'm not at that stage. I'm still learning to walk, right? I shouldn't be running at this point in time. And so I guess it is a reminder to go back to basics, start from scratch again. I'm now immersing myself in a whole bunch of different tutorials and YouTube videos and everything I can kind of get my hands on. That certainly is going to be the bulk of the content on my leave, which I've still taken, even though I'm going to be at home doing not a whole lot. But yeah, it's kind of that idea of let's go back to basic, learn to walk before you can run.
There's so much to unpack there. I think it's what you're describing is a challenge that every creative faces in the beginning of their career, because I think we all look at the professionals, we look at the superstars in whatever field we are looking at. So in photography, Chad, I know you'll have a couple names where you absolutely love their stuff, and you look at their brand, you look at the photos they create, and like you say, it's instinctively theirs. You can see exactly what photo is theirs, and it feels like they've got this perfect niche, this perfect domination of one particular style that has made them famous. And you can look at all of them and you can decide, cool, I want to copy him, or I want to copy a bit of him, or I want to copy a bit of him. And it feels like when you put it all together, it doesn't feel authentic, or it doesn't feel like you sometimes. And that is something that a lot of creatives face as we try and find our way in this world. When we're still in the early stages, we're still, like you say, learning to run, learning to walk, trying to get our feet wet and kind of figure out what is our creative output going to look like. It can be paralyzing to decide, cool, what is my brand? Am I going to stick to it for the rest of my life? That's a huge decision. So let me kind of wait and see what I'm going to post. And I think for a lot of us, like you say, it actually comes down to more experimentation. And sometimes we have to force ourselves to post things that aren't ready yet, or to post things that we've been holding back on because we're worried about a certain brand. We're worried about how this might look compared to other stuff we've posted in the past. And it's such a difficult balance to strike, because we watch all these pros, we see how well they've kind of made a niche for themselves, and we want to do the same, but at the same time we don't have the body of work yet to understand exactly what makes us unique compared to them.
Barry, you kind of mentioned it in the perfect framing there, and that is that we look at this and we kind of sometimes want to copy styles. We sometimes want to buy a preset, and that's the thing, is you can copy styles these days. You can buy a preset, you can buy a LUT, you can buy whatever the heck they're calling it in your particular field, and in a way copy that style. But once you've done that, and I'm guilty of having done that fairly recently, I now have a myriad of presets and styles to use. But like you say, none of them feel like me. I can slap that on and be left with something that I might like looking at, but it doesn't feel like me. And it is a really tough thing, this whole finding your style thing. I guess it's similar to when you were starting out your writing, Barry. You've got a whole bunch of authors that you look up to, and ultimately you really enjoy their work, and you could pick their words, use their kind of styles and grammar and patterns of writing, all of that kind of stuff. But it's not going to feel authentic. It's not going to feel like you. And at which point do you start to develop a voice of your own and start to stand out from the crowd, so to speak?
Spot on. That's exactly what you go through as a writer, and I think it's rather similar to photography, like you say. And I think that it's still an important part of the process, that copying phase, because when you're still learning the craft, you're still learning how to kind of get things right and what mistakes to avoid and whatnot. It is important to copy people who are really good at things, because you learn through that process. But like you say, at some point you have to start developing your own style. And I'm of the belief that quantity here is what matters. I'm flabbergasted sometimes by artists or creatives who have all this material, all this content, and they just don't post because they think it's not perfect, or they don't like the look of it, or whatever the story is. Whereas my opinion is that the only way to figure out what works for you is actually to put it in the court of public opinion. You can think about these things for years and years and years and years and outthink yourself to no end. But the real test of art, and the real test of making a message or making an impact in someone's life, is putting it out there into the world and seeing what response it gets. And so I'm a firm believer of quantity, especially at the beginning when you're still trying to figure it out, because that is the way to test ideas. That's the way to test how something feels. And you might post something and then 2 hours later you're like, oh, I really don't like that at all, right? And that's the kind of negative feeling you have to be okay with, because that's the idea of quantity. And so I'm a firm believer in that. But again, that's not the only way to do it. There's been lots of examples of a wide range of ways to get to creative success. At the end of the day, you have to find a way to get out of your own way. Find a way to kind of stick to what is true to you, stick to what feels like your work, and then actually publish it and move on to other stuff without worrying about what people are going to say, without worrying about the view count or the likes or any of that sort of thing. Because if you're not publishing things, if you're not shipping products, if you're not getting your stuff out there into the world, then you can drive yourself insane with all of these conversations, Chad.
Yeah, definitely. And that's exactly my experience, is that I have been hitting upload on certain things, but now that I look at it together as like a body together, not just each post in isolation individually, when I'm gathering my portfolio, I'm struggling to find the common ties and the common binds, and that is for me a problem. But a lot of people might look at it and say that there's no problem there, and so I guess you also have to get out of your own head and just trust the process. Create. You will get better eventually.
Yeah, definitely. And I can't really speak to photography. It's not my field. So that advice might not be relevant for what you're chatting about. But at the end of the day, I do believe that we care very much about consistency in our brand, and sometimes to a fault. I know there's a lot of creators who are well known for creating one type of thing, and then they're super scared to try and create something different because it's not proven, right? And the audience has come to expect a certain thing. And so there's that huge fear, that huge gap you've got to jump over to create something new. And you've got to accept the possibility that people hate the new thing and you kind of lose that relevance, right? And that's the fear that is behind all of those decisions. But at the end of the day, if you are an artist, if you consider yourself a creative, your creative expression has to come first. That's just what it's about, right? Unless you're trying to make money from this, and unless it's your full-time job, that is your family are depending on it, right? But if you're in the early stages of your career and your creative expression is about that, it's about kind of expressing whatever you're trying to message, whatever you're trying to talk about, I really do think that you can only do that in the arena. You can't do it on the side, like you say, thinking about what is my style going to be? How do I make a niche for myself? How do I make sure I'm recognizable over time? I really do think you have to get stuff into the world and then see what patterns emerge naturally. And like you say, you might not see the patterns now, but you're still so early in your process. There's still such a long way to go in this journey.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for that, Barry. I'll definitely kind of just keep trying, not be so hard on myself. Hopefully it does happen. It does click at some stage. But for the meantime, I'm going to, like I said, over this next couple of days, got a nice break running up to New Year that I'm looking forward to kind of just reflecting a bit again. It's kind of like at the beginning of lockdown when we had all this free time, which now we have filled up doing things. So to not have to, do the kind of 9 to 5, it will be good. It will be nice to kind of unwind a bit and be able to actually put some proper time into this craft that I do really love. So yeah. How about you, Barry? Are you going to be taking some time off to reflect and, I guess, recharge somewhat?
I'm hoping to, Chad. At the moment, things are absolutely crazy. I don't know why, but my work and my business has really grown in the last couple of days and last couple of weeks. And so things are very chaotic at the moment. But I do hope to have some time over the festive period to reflect and set some goals for 2021 and kind of figure out where do we go to from here after this crazy, insane year that has torn all of our lives apart. How do we kind of move forward? How do we take stock of what's happened to us? How do we kind of recharge the batteries and see what's going to happen going forward? And so I'd encourage everyone out there as well, if you're listening or watching right now, take some time to yourself to think about 2020, close that book, and then figure out what is your game plan for 2021 as we kind of move into what hopefully will be a better year, Chad.
Yeah, 100%. Take stock and rebuild, Barry, because that's what we are built to do as a human species. We are built to overcome all of these hardships, and we can do it. I know it doesn't seem likely at the moment, but we can. That ding is the end of our episode. We just reached the end. We've been talking a heck of a lot. We again had to shift a whole bunch of stuff off of the agenda because we had a little bit too much. But Barry, do you realize that next week is going to be our New Year episode? We're going to look at the favorite things of ours that happened in the year, reflect back on all of the goals we had set for last year, which I haven't looked at in a while.
Oh boy. And, that's going to be terrible.
And maybe even set some new ones.
Yeah, Chad, it is kind of crazy that the year is done. And like you say, I'm looking forward to that episode. It always is a fan favorite. So please do tune in next week. Hit that subscribe button. get on our social media. Let us know what you think. And we're really looking forward to diving deep into 2021 from next week and beyond. But for now, I'd like to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas and a wonderful New Year. Please be safe out there. Please be responsible out there as best you can. Be grateful for what you have. And if you are able to spend time with friends and family, cherish it, make the most of it. If you aren't, reach out to people, get on those Zoom calls, get on those phone calls, and make the most out of this rather strange Christmas, Chad. That is it from me, Barry, and he's Chad. Thank you for listening to another episode of Across the Pond, and we'll see you again next week.
Pond, across the pond with Barry and Chad.
Okay, now I'm straight. Or am I?
You can fix it in post.
I mean, the camera looks very skewed, to be fair.
Chad, your audio sounds different. I don't know
Oh,
if
it's
it's
bad.
affected on your side. Oh, there we go. That's fine better now.
Yeah?
It sounded hollow, but I don't know if it's just the Zoom. I'm so sorry, Chad. It's a these bloopers keep destroying me. Okay. But the positivity that's down the line. She's like, sorry.
Big question that everyone is asking. But in terms of that,
On which is the Pfizer vaccine and the the Pfizer vaccine.
But then the thing is, then are we keeping this on when we're talking about Oscar Pistorius?
We'll take it off for Oscar.
I just-
I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing here.
Is it called Megxit? Megxit?
What?
Have you not heard of Megxit?
I don't. I've never heard of Megxit. No.
The ability to tune yourself straight into someone's kind of conscious almost, and be able to affect. Oh. Sorry. Sounds like we're brainwashing people. A game called Cyberpunk 2077, and I just did a Jacob Zuma.
I was about to call you out on it.
Absolutely, and for all of the whenever a doubt, just started absolutely.
We should have a little absolutely counter in the bottom right of our episodes. There's an insane amount of money. That is an insane amount of money.
And then
Okay,
so
sorry.
it's fine. It's fine. I'll pick it up.
I don't know what else to say. Don't buy it. So her judgment was basically that, like, he had a reasonable, what's the word? He had a reasonable.
whether they're going to get an. I almost wonder whether they're going to get. I almost wonder whether they are going to get a. I'm going to speak too fast. Barry, we saw another little story this week about kind of subwater. While we're talking about military, we came across a story this week, Barry, where we're talking about kind of using. Sorry. While we're talking about military, Barry, you came across another story this week.
I love how you just gave up. That's amazing. And China is.
Sorry.
I'm so hot in this hat.
Oh, really?
Sorry. It's like 1,000 degrees. Okay.
How about you, Barry? Going to be taking some time off? Going to be taking some time. How about you, Barry? Are you going to be taking some time off?
I love how you just don't stop. You make a mistake and you just keep on this without even breathing. You just keep going. It's going to be really cool to look at our what are we going to look at next year? And she's like, terrible. I'm just repeating what you said.